Hello, everybody, and a huge welcome to folks. I think we have people from potentially, well, definitely across Ireland and potentially maybe a bit further. We're definitely welcoming Chris from Bonnie, Scotland. I got to live there for a while. Absolutely love the place. Chris, whereabouts in Scotland are you based?
I'm in Aberdeen.
I didn't make it to Aberdeen, but
the part that nobody goes to.
I don't know. I hear very nice things, though. I know a couple of people who live there. We just didn't have the opportunity.
A couple of days a year.
Good. A couple of days a year you get some sunshine, is that it?
Yeah.
We're well used to it. It's rain and grey for most of the time here in Ireland as well. What did Billy Connolly say? No such thing as bad weather, just the wrong clothes.
That's it.
A wise man. Everybody, huge welcome and thanks again to Chris. So Chris, there has been a great excitement in the last couple of weeks to hear you speak and finally come and stop sitting on that fence that you sit on so much. But in all seriousness, you've such a refreshing take on things. You're very clear and down the line. It's very easy to understand what your stance is, but I'm sure there's going to be some interest in posting questions today. Chris's company, FirstBase. So when you guys were founded?
September last year. And we certainly wish we were 3 months earlier, but basically we'd created that as an internal product in our last startup where we went remote, discovered some of the challenges and obstacles with getting our team set up and built the product before we realized a lot of other remote teams had the same issues.
Such a huge need. Would you like to give us a little bit of background on yourself, Chris? Some pieces of information that you think might be good for us to know about you?
Sure. Thought I was going to be a professional football player, soccer player, depending on your geography. Got a bad injury before I realized I was never going to be good enough, which I think in retrospect was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to focus on academics. Studied architecture, realized pretty early on I never wanted to be an architect, but I think at that time I had this realization that it was a better generalist business degree than a business degree. And the reason I thought that was because architecture is basically take historical precedent, integrate the modern technology of the day and create something new. So the same way Uber was the reinvention of the taxi industry, Microsoft took IBM's mainframe computer and made the PC. Spotify was basically a reinvention of peer-to-peer sharing for the music industry. Graduated, I'm in Aberdeen. Obviously, you fall into the oil and gas industry, but I think you realize pretty quickly it's not the most intellectually stimulating field in the world. So I started doing a lot of other things out with the 9 to 5. Wrote a blog that grew to 40,000 followers on Medium. That led me to connect with people like James Watt at Brewdog, Gareth Williams at Skyscanner, some early stage investors in London. And by late 2017, I was looking for my next career move. Was interviewing at Airbnb, Uber, was looking at MBA programs in the States, was talking to James and Gareth and a few VCs in London about roles with them, but ultimately decided to found a fintech business. And we decided at the outset we were going to be a remote team. I want to spend more time with my family. I never want to commute anymore. I've got 2 little girls and I really want to see them grow up. My CTO was about to have his first child and he wanted to be there to see him walk for the first time and hear him laugh for the first time. So we became a remote team and as I said, started encountering these challenges and obstacles with doing that. And FirstBase basically emerged organically as we tried to overcome them for ourselves.
That's amazing. And you're not the first startup team I've heard that were driven to go remote because of family. I mean, it's so important, like absolutely. And good luck to that commute.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of people spend time speaking about remote as the future of work. And I think the way that we see it is actually it's the future of living. Work is an aspect of that, but actually the quality of life upgrade's the key thing that we've tried to focus on.
I want to say to everyone, if anybody wants to unmute and hop in to ask a question, or if you're more comfortable in using the chat, you can use the chat to ask questions as well, please. And I just have a couple of questions from the community of people who couldn't make it today that I'll be jotting in as I go. So does anybody want to jump in with a question there?
Well, I just want to say, Chris, as someone who follows you on Twitter quite a bit, keep it up. You're doing a lot of good work in explaining to a lot of people what's going on. I have to say, it's really fascinating what you've been doing. So keep it going.
I appreciate that. And I think it's one of these things where I think people just need to take stock of the fact that this is remote working during a global pandemic. It's forced remote during something that we just can't control. And I think many of us who have worked remotely have experienced those intangible benefits that you get when you can work remotely and you don't have to commute, and you can go out to the coffee shop with a friend, or you can have more in-depth hobbies because you're not stuck in an office till 7 o'clock every night. And I think it's important that we try to communicate that to people who may be having a less than stellar time right now, where they're homeschooling kids, they're unable to see friends and family, and things of that nature.
Chris, have you noticed much of a difference in how people are feeling about remote, with going suddenly remote this year from March to now?
Yeah, I think there's probably two parts to that. I think there's the general part around people who were already remote. And I think this is just, in many ways, continuation and really acceleration of those trends. You looked at remote growing 400% decade over decade the last 10 years. And this is accelerated by probably 10 to 15 years in the last 6 months. And the reason for that is, in my eyes, is that prior to COVID, this was something being driven by talent, expectations of working conditions, going to your employer, going to a new employer and saying, if you're going to employ me, I want to work remotely. Now the shoe's on the other foot to an extent, where if companies don't go remote, there's this remote working dilemma, right? Where your biggest competitors, if they go more remote than you, they're going to be able to attract more talented people because their talent pool is wider, and they're simultaneously going to be more cost efficient. And I think that the implication of that on teams and workers individually is that a whole host of people who would never have tried remote working have been exposed to it. And you look at the statistics coming out now around how many people never want to go back to an office full time. 90% of people. How many people never want to go back to an office full stop? 50% of people. And then you start to look at the more in-depth responses from places like Google, where I think the stats from Google were 92% of Google's employees said, we don't want to go back to an office full time either. And I think that's startling. Like, Google is probably universally seen as the best office experience on the planet. You get restaurants and masseuses and all this nonsense that adults don't really want from an office. But if they don't want to go back to an office, imagine what public at large is feeling towards this.
You don't hold back on your opinion of the office as a creche for adults. And I understand, you know, it's sometimes just capture people's imagination and attention. It's worthwhile going with the...
Can I just jump in, Rose?
Yes, Katerina, thank you.
Because Chris, you mentioned at the beginning of your last answer something about cost efficiency, and you connected it with talent. Can you elaborate if you see if we look at the equation, is it going remote or being remote, is it predominantly like a cost reduction or also an increase of benefits?
I think it's a cost reduction insofar as real estate cost. I don't see it really being a cost reduction in terms of talent cost. And I think the reason for that, and there'll be a spectrum, right? I think what you'll tend to see is people in San Francisco or New York will likely see wages falling across the next 10 years. Not dramatically, but they'll just normalize. And I think the reason for that is, as people decentralize, I think the cost of living inside these large cities is going to come down. So I think what you're beginning to see is some companies are saying, well, actually, we're going to try to use this as an opportunity to cut salary. And I think what you'll see is people leaving those employers because they'll have so much option. And the best anecdotal insight of that I've got is, we're currently progressing with their professional service firm in the Midwest in the US. And they've historically been the highest average payer in that region. And they've been working towards signing an accountant for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Things were going smoothly. It looked like it was about to come to fruition on a Tuesday. And basically Microsoft announced they were going remote and they were going to start hiring across the US. And that person, that professional service firm was going to hire, has now went to Microsoft for a 30% uplift on what the highest medium salary in that specific region is.
That actually, thanks, Katerina. That leads on lovely to a question that somebody had asked me, sent in by email, and they were just wondering your opinions on that, Chris. So you kind of, you gave some opinion there, like, you know, the market's going to sort it out. But even in the shorter term, do you have any sense of how things might play out as far as, you know, whether it's tied to location or more like Buffer does, where they have a calculation around how they come up with salary?
Yeah, the honest answer is I'm not sure. I think my inclination is that it probably goes towards doing it based on geography. But then my next response to that is, well, if you're producing the same amount of work as someone that lives in a different place, why should that dictate how much compensation you get? Their cost of living shouldn't be something that dictates how much compensation you get for doing your job. Just because they're living in a place, why should your same employer subsidize cost of living? And I think that's in many respects what's happening in San Francisco and New York, and probably to a lesser extent places like London. And I think the reality is, if you choose to live elsewhere, that's your choice. You should have a higher disposable income based on that. And I think what we'll do as an organization is we'll pay a standard salary based on wherever someone lives. My personal feeling is that's the right way to do it, but I think that's just how we feel about it.
Were you surprised at the approach by any of the employers that have announced going remote and their approach to pay?
Yeah, and I think there's an element of one-upmanship coming to this as well. I think you see Reddit's response to say, we're going to pay SF in New York salaries wherever you live. Now, if you're a highly skilled software engineer, are you going to go to Facebook where they're going to try and cut your cost of living, or are you going to go to Reddit? So what you'll see happen, and I mentioned it briefly before, is there's a remote work dilemma of sorts that will emerge, where if you're less remote than your biggest competitor, you're likely to lose people to them incredibly quickly. And I think what you'll probably see happen is office first companies going back in and basically going out of business in the same way that 10 years ago you were seeing happening to e-commerce and bricks and mortar. I think this is exactly the same thing that's going to play out in the remote workspace versus office first companies.
I think it'll be really interesting to see as well what happens in the shorter term, especially with, you know, as economies stand at the moment. But I look forward to when the market does settle that somewhat. For anybody who's just joined us in the last few minutes, just want to say, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please do, or you can use the chat function to ask a question.
Actually, Rose, it's John Murphy here. Just a quick one for Chris, maybe on a sidebar, but the parenting at work dilemma, where do you sit in that scenario?
Insofar as kids being at home during the workday?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I'll speak to this from our perspective, where when we're hiring people, our stance is that we want to hire the best person on the planet, irrespective of their living situation. So we don't want to be the best place on the planet for white males to work. And historically, that's what the office has been, right? Like, everyone knows that promotion decisions are made in the pub after work, and if you are like this person or you support the same sports teams. And I think that's simplifying something that there are obviously complexities to. But yeah, for us, we want to be the best place that single parents can work at, the best place that people who physically can't get into the office can work at, people who can't get visas to work in specific countries can work at. And I think what you need to accept, if that's going to be your stance, is that people will have situations where not always they're going to have childcare at home. And I think in certain respects, there may be a company responsibility to help people with that as well. You don't want parents falling out the workforce. And I think the other part is remote work doesn't necessarily mean work from home, which it clearly has meant during COVID enforced remote working. When I talk about remote work, what I'm really talking about is work from anywhere. And that means if you've got kids at home, maybe they're at a nursery 3 days a week, maybe they're at your parents 2 days a week and what have you. But yeah, I think this is something that we still have to iron out, but I think that's how we certainly view it ourselves.
I think part of the challenge actually is this business mindset change that needs to happen, that you're going to be results focused, not 9 to 5 focused.
For sure.
Yeah.
Like it's so irrational to think that the majority of office jobs are knowledge based. Mm-hmm. Now, the expectation that you're going to sit in a seat for 8 hours and be productive for the whole day, is ridiculous. Like I'm productive. I'm probably most productive from 6 in the morning till 8 6 in the morning till 8 in the morning. And then I'll do something else. I might read for half an hour. I'll go and work out for 30 minutes. I'll then get back to work, and then I'll try and have my meetings in the afternoon. And this continuation of industrial revolution norms, where we've taken what we applied to factories to knowledge work, is killing productivity. And I think that's indisputable. And I think that transition, exactly what you're talking about, John, how do we transition from how much time did you sit in that seat to what is the outcome of the work that you've done? That's what really needs to happen.
Cheers. Thanks.
John, that's a good lead in actually to another question around that, Chris. You know, seeing things like the 4-day work week coming into other countries, and, you know, is there any other stuff you're seeing from, especially from companies you've spoken to, that we could be maybe, you know, that we can actually see a bit more enlightenment happening from companies and from management?
Yeah, I sort of feel like the 4-day work week is the natural evolution of what we've come to expect. I almost feel it's just an arbitrary extension of that, though. And I think what ultimately ends up happening is we just have a far better grasp of project management tools. And how can we use that to drive outcomes? So rather than saying, well, it's 5 days a week, it's 4 days a week, it's 2, whatever those things are, I think ultimately we'll end up in a place where we'll say, Chris has to produce this amount of work in a week. Some weeks it's going to take me 18 hours to do that. Some weeks it's going to take me 46 hours to do that. And I think as a business owner, do I care if someone gets is absolutely killing it and they're only working 16 hours a week? Absolutely not. But I think the historical mindset is, well, I need my pound of flesh, and that's going to be 40 hours of your time for that 5 days a week.
Rose, I'd like to ask Chris a question, if it's okay.
Absolutely, Kevin. Go ahead. Thank you.
Just on market dynamics, Chris, I follow you religiously on Twitter. It's great. Just on the market dynamics, what's your thoughts on sort of countries or geographical areas offering incentives or trying to ring fence jobs, remote kind of jobs within certain areas? Just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly interesting. And if I was a small country with great education and benefits that come from, I don't know, natural beauty, whether it's access to the beach, to skiing or other things, why wouldn't you leverage everything that you can to attract world-class people? And I think what Tulsa Remote are doing is interesting. I'm not necessarily sure that's the sort of final evolution of that. What I think you'll see is companies trying to attract talented students by forgiving student loan debt. Heard a couple of countries thinking about that. And I think ultimately where you want to get to is how do you increase the density of just high quality talent in your nation? And whether that's on a nation by nation basis, a region by region basis, it just makes all the sense in the world. Leverage what you can and then use that to attract better talent, which ultimately you're going to benefit from the taxable base.
Thanks, Chris.
And that's just led on beautifully to another question that was submitted. And the question was, what do you see as some of the key skills that people should be focusing on around remote working?
I think communication is the biggest one. And I think it's non-verbal communication. I spend a lot of time speaking about asynchronous first versus remote first versus office first. And I think really that's the key superpower that you'll see many of the remote companies talking about. So whether that's GitLab or Zapier or just any of those companies, Shopify to an extent as well, I guess. And it's the difference between building a single source of truth, which is the knowledge base inside an organization, versus the verbal communication that happens in offices, where if you're not in the room at the time, you don't get that piece of information and you're sort of detrimentally impacted by that. And I think that's also the key challenge that going remote poses to specific types of organization. It's really easy to take what we know in the office, the instantaneous gratification of availability, jumping on Zoom calls for every time that we would otherwise have tapped someone on the shoulder. But I think in many ways, what you've got to look at that as is destroying the benefits of remote working, being able to do that deep focused work without the distraction that comes from not being in an open plan office.
And further on from that then, for yourselves in FirstBase, what does that look like?
A lot of email. somewhat surprisingly. We've sort of bounced between tools. I think it's funny. I think people invariably want to use Slack. Slack is a terrible work tool. And I just, that's how I feel. Zoom, again, we've taken things that were phone calls to be Zoom calls now, where they were never face-to-face calls in the first place. I think that's problematic. We've sort of tried to move towards things like Twist. I don't know how aware you are of that. That's basically what the Doist team created. It just lets you be a lot more organized, process-driven, and regimented around communication. But I think it's not perfect yet. I think there's probably no tool that we've seen as being, this is the one that we would fully recommend to say async. I think email is actually still the best async communication tool in the market.
What do you see in the major issue with, say, something like Slack?
It's more distracting than working in an open plan office.
Yeah, I can agree with that at times for sure. As far as then, yes, Katerina, please come in.
Is this, so I, as a researcher working with Slack as a source of kind of data, so analyzing communication, Slack is great for me. But to your point about it is distracting, to what degree is it the culture of the company that makes the tool distracting, or is the distraction a built-in feature of the tool?
I think it's human nature, and I think there's certainly better ways that organizations can document processes by which you use tools. I think GitLab do a great job of basically doing this, where they say, this is when a new channel will be created. This is when a thread will be created. And I think they do a fairly great job of policing that. I think unless that's a muscle the organization's built up, it's difficult to be in a position where the tool is great for the purposes that you're intending for. I think there's just a lot of implications of using it, which it becomes easy to fall back into other characteristics of communication, if that makes sense.
Lucy, please come in.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for talking with us today. It's really interesting, this conversation about the single source of truth. And I think ultimately it doesn't really matter what tools we're using, as long as everyone in the organization is on board with what we're doing and when we use what. One thing that I've been doing quite a bit of research in this area, working with some clients who are looking at hybrid options of working. And I'm closer and closer coming to the conclusion that you're probably likely going to be more successful to be 100% distributed or pretty much on site. And you need to be really conscious if you're going to build a hybrid organization. You nearly need to build it as distributed, and then people can come in or not for particular types of things. So maybe if it's creative work or collaboration work, then you come in, or maybe some people just like to come in. But ultimately, you nearly need to build the organization to be distributed or fully remote. What are your thoughts on that? Are you seeing any successful hybrid things working? And I suppose at this stage, maybe not, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, and anyone else here as well, if you guys have been doing that.
Totally agree. I think the problem with going hybrid is twofold. So I think typically wherever leadership is in the organization, that's what's going to determine the prominent culture inside the organization. So if leadership's in the office, people feel like they have to be there because that's the only way for promotions to happen. I think people realize quickly that if you're hybrid, it's the worst of both worlds. And the reason for that is that it dilutes the benefits or perceived benefits of both. And I'll talk to that from a remote perspective. If you still have to live close enough to an office to get there twice a week, once a week, you still have to be in a commutable distance. And that might mean rather than being within a 30-minute commutable distance, you can be in a 60-minute commutable distance. But it doesn't mean that you can completely decentralize away from that city and live wherever you want. And I think that's that. And what we've really seen where that's happened, and this is pre-COVID, I think we don't really have the data yet because the organizations that are going remote due to COVID just aren't seeing that. They haven't went back to the office enough to know what they're going to do. But what we have seen pre-COVID is companies that went remote and then said, well, actually, we're going to pull people into an office, or we're going to expect them to come into a co-working space. the attendance falls off a cliff rapidly. People that start out going into a co-working space 4 days a week quickly becomes 2 days a week, and then it becomes Mondays and Fridays, and then nobody goes within a 3-4 month period because they have moved away from the space. And there's maybe 10, 15 companies that we know that have had 30 seats in WeWorks, 20 seats in WeWorks, where within a 6 month period, the attendance is around 5%. And I think that's what we'll see happening with a lot of hybrid organizations.
Yeah. It's Aidan, I see your comment there as well, just that hybrid needs good leadership. And again, that's what we're seeing in the research. And I think, to be honest, remote needs good leadership. I think this is, we talk a lot about this mindset shift, and it's like we need to be changing it at the top in order to make it successful through the organization. And yeah, the more I do on this and the more people I'm talking to, I'm like, okay, we have so much work to do in this area, making sure that organizing, because I feel people's health is at stake here as well if we don't get this right now as well in the long term. So, but yeah, anyway, thank you, Chris. It was good to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and just to continue on that a little bit. Sorry, Tracy. I was on a panel with Darren Murph from GitLab yesterday, and I think his take on the leadership debate is we're moving more from a command and control office-based leadership to what he termed empathetic leadership. And I think there's a lot of things written across the last 10, 15 years around servant leadership. And I think that's the key here. Is that going to emerge? I think we hope so, but will it?
Yeah, and that, just to add to that, my background, I actually did work in Google in the great space and the wonderful offices for quite some time. But one thing that I realized when I stepped out of the organization was that we did have very much a task-based OKR system. And when I started to work with clients outside, I couldn't believe how little organizations actually have that. So I do think it's a combination of really clear team roles, responsibilities, tasks, and then that allows the leadership to focus on being an empathetic leader with good emotional intelligence and really focus their energy there. But yeah, it's the leadership piece is a big one for me.
Actually, Lucy, I mean that emotional intelligence is the key skill that managers and leaders need going forward, for whether it is remote, whether it is office-based or hybrid, to get the most out of their people anyway. But Chris, a question I'm curious of actually is with regard to career development. You actually mentioned it yourself. A lot depends on actually where the leaders are, because if you're in the office, the more you're seen, the better your chances are of possibly getting that next step. And it's, where do you see the role or the responsibility lying with regard to remote working, as to whether is it up to the manager to keep track of actually what the person is doing, or is it up to each individual to take ownership of their career, and actually they're the ones that should be promoting themselves?
I think it depends. I think Lucy mentioned OKRs, and I think these tools that enable us to measure outcomes and actually track performance on a far more granular level need to be taken into consideration when those decisions are made. I think what you see just now, there's just not a lot of accountability as to how progression decisions are made inside organizations. And to echo Lucy's points, it's incredible how many large organizations with 50,000 plus people who have no tangible understanding of how much work they're producing on a weekly, daily, monthly, yearly basis. It's incredible. And I think if you're not doing that, it is incredibly difficult to advance. Now, the other part is that I think people do have to take a lot of responsibility for the networking aspect that is still crucial to advancing inside organizations. So when you're talking about remote, it's not just we're going to be fully remote. I think what organizations and their people need to come to some understanding with is cadence for in-person interaction, cadence that enables those deeper ties to be built, because I think that's a contributing factor to how people will progress alongside the outcome that they're actually producing. Actually,
virtual coffee, I think, is the one that could have a big positive experience for most people.
Yeah, and I think there's parts of that which, if done correctly, leads to far more diversity of thought. I think there are always silos inside organization, but today we're producing so much information around communication. What you can really understand is people that are key people inside organizations, insofar as being nodes of connection between different people. You should be able to measure that and cultivate that in ways where people get to know other people, which they wouldn't get sitting in office 212 in building with 32 different floors.
Yeah, agreed.
We're hearing a lot from people who would have worked in a more traditional office setting that have come into remote roles over this year. So experiencing, 100% remote onboarding, and they said they've never felt more connected with a team, even where they had worked for years within an office, but because it's been deliberate, that it's just been handled so much better.
Yeah, and I think like generally people have a terrible onboarding experience inside organizations. Now, my CTO joined nameless American bank 5 years ago before he came on board as we built that fintech business. And he sat in a seat for 2 weeks without a computer. Now, he had a 3-month notice period that they had to get that in place. And then he gets the computer and he doesn't have actually it gets worse than that. So actually he's an American citizen. So he gets his computer after 2 weeks, and he goes to IT and he says, "Can I get an American keyboard? I'm incredibly unproductive with a British keyboard." And they said, "Sure, it'll be here in a couple of days." A couple of days pass, he goes back to his IT manager. He said, "Oh, actually, sorry, the different process. What you need to do is go on to SAP, ServiceNow, whatever it was, order that. They'll ship it from the US. It'll be here. It'll take about 2 weeks. You're just going to have to make do." Well, two years later, he's put his notice period in to join me at the fintech, and the keyboard turns up. So yeah, that's a pretty decent anecdote.
That is a bit of a horror story. And
sorry, I have to say this one. I worked for a large corporate organization in the IT side of things, and the HR, no offense to people on the call here actually involved in HR, but they do a crap job in notifying people on new startups. And one of the things that actually happened there was we brought in AI to go along and actually manage all of the processes associated with onboarding. And all of a sudden, actually, your turnaround and the satisfaction went up tenfold because everyone got notified well in advance to be able to do what needs to be done.
they got the keyboard they wanted.
Here's another one. So before we pivoted to FirstBase, we're building the fintech business. We're basically coming to the end of that. So we went to a few of the banks that we were talking to about that and said, we're not doing this fintech stuff anymore, but we're doing this stuff in the remote FirstBase. Is it interesting for you guys? And one of the women we were working with pretty closely pulls us over to the side of the room, and she pulls open 5 drawers of an old metal gray filing cabinet. And I swear to God, there are 1,600 iPads inside these drawers. And they say, I don't know whose they are, where they came from, how old they are. I actually don't even know if we own them. And I think that's interesting in an office environment, and you extrapolate that to people working remotely around the globe. And yeah, it's an incredibly difficult problem for anyone to solve, be that IT or HR.
Actually, getting into your business of things, Chris, equipment-wise, what sort of trends have you seen that you found kind of interesting? Is there stuff that you think that people are really struggling to wrap their heads around? And have you seen any really cool solutions to this suddenly remote that we've dealt with this year?
Yeah, one of the biggest banks in the US asked, and they didn't proceed with it, so I'll temper that expectation, but they did ask if we could provide Peloton bikes to each of their trading team, which was interesting. I think there's 2 parts to this, right? There's the first part is, how do we make sure that people have what they need at home in a pandemic? So that's a reaction to that. Can we make sure that people have desks, chairs, and laptops that work and they're able to access the system securely? And I think we're progressing through that aspect just now. Then I think the next phase becomes, okay, now that we have people set up to not get injured, they've got the right chair, they've got the right desk, they've got 2 monitors, they've got ergonomic mice and keyboards, etc. The next problem then becomes, how do we provide a better experience to our teams? And I think we're starting to enter that domain. So we've had companies ask if we can do coffee machines, monthly coffee bean subscriptions. We've had others ask if we can do prepaid debit cards to pay stipends for internet expenses. How can we do single click ordering so that we can give our team food on a Friday, things like that. So I think that's the next step. The first step is just getting people set up so we don't have injury risk and security issues.
Out of that, actually, Chris, the add-on stuff, is there anything in particular that's really capturing the employee's imagination?
I think the employee's expectation is actually really low. I think people don't necessarily expect their companies to provide them with the right tools and equipment at home when they absolutely should. Like, they provide you with things in an office that is for two reasons. One, you need it to do great work. Two, if you get injured, the company gets sued. I think that's what we're beginning to see emerge in the remote space, where if your company doesn't give you the requisite equipment and you get injured, the companies are going to get hammered with this. And anecdotally, we're hearing reports of 40 to 60% of people complaining about back pain and neck pain and repetitive strain injuries and things like that. So I think just the expectation is going to grow. I think companies will compete on this in the same way that they do in the physical environment. Not sure where it ends up.
Yeah. I can attest to the back thing. I went messing with the tilt on my chair a few weeks ago and it was a bad idea.
Chris, quick question for you. I work in Bank of Ireland and we're on the embedding remote work team, and we were just running with our pilot teams today, and the conversation changed to connection. Obviously in Ireland we're in level 5 lockdown, max lockdown, plus winter, plus everything. So everything's heightened, and the best kind of comparison I could have in terms of a solution was something that Shopify do, the donut app. Well, lots of companies do it, the donut plug-in into Slack, and those sporadic coffees, introductions that you can make across the organization. When you've got, say, 10,000 employees, it's a lot, right? Do you know of any tool that is the equivalent to kind of what Donut does, but for organizations that don't use Slack? Because a lot of larger enterprises wouldn't be so comfortable using that as their primary comms tool.
Yeah, there's a couple. So one is Icebreaker, which is almost facilitated conversations that takes it a step past Donut. I think that's quite interesting. There's probably not many that are better than that, to be quite honest.
It's icebreaker.com, is it? I think.
I'm not sure if it is. If you can't find it, I'll try and find it. The logo's like a blue logo with a crack through an ice cube, if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you can't find it, I can shoot you a message after.
I'll look for here. That's really useful. I think social isolation is through education and training board. We're training up 25 different enterprises and their management teams, and this is coming up time and time again, and building internal communities, and that's just a little piece of technology that could be very useful, Chris, so thank you for that.
Yeah, the only other thing I've seen, and it's from a slightly different perspective, but it's super interesting, which is Stripe's Home. So if you just type in Stripe Home, they'll have a document based on their internal, it's basically an intranet, but what they layer into that is like quizzes to figure out who's who inside the organization. They do like birthday shout outs, all these kind of things. And yeah, we've been playing about with this for a while, basically building something similar for ourselves that we're calling Campfire. And I think we may eventually roll that out, but yeah, we're not quite ready to yet.
Quizzes are a great idea. One of the things that came up is that when you're in a building, you can walk past, teams, and you'd be able to say, okay, that's the payments team, that's the HR team, and you'll kind of even subconsciously put faces to names, and you'll kind of subconsciously group out, and you'll know who's where. And in a remote team, everything is kind of like dipping into a black hole. You're not able to see that as easily. So that sounds fantastic, really useful, exactly a solution to exactly the problem we were listening to today.
Thanks, Tracy. Oh, absolutely. Something we're definitely hearing a lot of. Is that going to be a standalone product, Chris?
I don't know. My CTO is going to kill me. Maybe I don't know. Yeah, I think I think we'd like to roll something out that's generally helpful for organizations, and I think tools like that are generally helpful. I think we've, like many of you here, we've worked remotely for a long time, and I think we just know that there's certain things that are problems, and I think as a natural byproduct of that, we try to solve our own problems. And I think we're slow to recognize that other people can often use those tools as well. And I think, yeah, maybe we should just start releasing stuff and seeing if it's helpful, and if it isn't, nobody will use it.
The demand is definitely out there. Just around that question, actually, have you seen any nice ways that companies, organizations, or teams have fostered serendipity?
Branch.gg is quite interesting. So what they're doing with spatial sound, I think is what they call it. Serendipity is hard, but and in many ways I think it's overrated. So I think everyone talks about, all these problems that we solve at the water cooler, and you're like, yeah, well, if that's true, your processes are broken. Like, if you're leaving solving problems to chance, like, that's an issue. So I think that, yeah, I've never bought into serendipity as a thing. I think there's nice things that often happen. What you really need to do is improve connections and improve quality connections. And I think that happens when you have time together in person. I'm highly skeptical of these water cooler tools, which I think in many respects are just organizations perpetuating a culture of surveillance.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. I would have the community hat on pretty much most of the time, so I'm thinking about it, the human connection. But absolutely, you're right. It shouldn't be the fallback for how you solve problems within an organization.
What I think you really want, like, you still want that, right? Like, you want to be able to slide into a conversation without any friction. But I don't think you want that to be default. You don't want, there's certain tools where you can literally see what other people are working on at that time. Like, is that a good thing? Probably not. Like, I think good remote work requires trust. And I think certain organizations don't have that trust. And I think when you become a remote organization, you need to assume that you're a professional and you're going to do your work. And I think ultimately people will either show that or won't show that. But this expectation that people need to earn trust before they get it is ridiculous, to be quite honest.
You're here. John Murphy, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a question, and I'm not picking on anyone on this call here actually, but the question, camera on or camera off, what's your take on that one, Chris?
I don't have any hard takes on it, to be quite honest. I think there's multiple facets to it that I think depending on what gender you are, depending on what age you are, depending on other factors that you may not be able to appreciate, just makes it super difficult to have an expectation either way. I think there's probably situations where you benefit from being able to look at the whites of someone's eyes virtually, and I think there's benefits that come from that. But yeah, I think increasingly we spend more time on calls than we do on video calls. That's us. I think it's just hard prescribing anything, to be quite honest.
I mean, the most common reason actually I've heard from people as to why they don't like putting on a camera is they don't like looking at themselves as part of what's going on. Like, if you're in an office or you're sitting from someone, you're looking at them, you're not looking at yourself. And I think that's one of the things that some people have. They don't feel comfortable actually in that type of a scenario. And again, to your point, there's no right or wrong answer. It's what's best for you. But
yeah, and I think there's like the other parts which are like, maybe we don't have a dedicated space in our home and we end up being in a bedroom and they don't want people to see that that's where we are. So
lovely
I think
though. I think it's so true. I think the thing that's come through for me is teams having a discussion about this and deciding when it is or isn't appropriate. That's probably the biggest thing, is that people know what's expected of them, and then also that there's a certain amount of flexibility depending on needs and requirements. Anybody else want to come in with a question?
Rose, can I just ask a quick question, please?
Please, Patrick.
Chris, I'm just wondering if you have noticed pre-COVID and during COVID, if there's been any impact in employees' well-being, and maybe by demographic, whether it be gender or age or anything that you've seen that sort of jumped out.
Yeah, and I would caveat this with it's difficult to make any firm assumptions while we're living through what we're living through. I think lockdown making it difficult to see friends and family and being able to go to restaurants and all the other stuff that we can naturally do when we're not living through a situation that we are. But I think there's almost this like pervasive issue that's starting to rear its head, which is remote is definitely more isolating and lonely than working in an office. And I'm not necessarily sure that that assumption is true. Are there times that it can be isolating and lonely? Absolutely. But I think I've got some fairly deep questions around whether your employer's HR team selecting the people you spend most time with leads to the deep relationships that we need to get to feel meaning. So I think for me, and I'll speak from personal experience, I think it's harder to speak for anyone else, but having worked remotely pre-COVID, it was something that enabled me to spend more time with my friends, spend more time with my family, spend more time doing hobbies where I have deep things in common with people outside of work. And I think in some respects, the office has become the anchor of social lives in ways that 20, 30 years ago, the church was, or other hobbies were. And I'm just not sure that's ultimately a good thing. I think there are definitely issues that we're seeing with respect to mental health right now. It's obvious. I think there are issues that people have while working remotely. I think the biggest difference is that if you're working in an office, you naturally spend time with people. If you work remotely, you have to be conscious about doing that. And I think there's implications on mental health if you don't appreciate that going into it.
Perfect, thank you.
Patrick, thanks so much for that. I totally agree. But I also recognize that I made the choice to work remotely for that reason, to free myself up, to go kayaking and all those things. Came across an interesting piece of research last summer, talking about the importance of us having interactions with strangers, which is something that so many of us would have missed out on this year. It actually helps to feel more part of our society. So I got really deliberate about making sure that I didn't go at least 2 days back to back, that I didn't head up to Lidl, to get my bit of shopping or go for a coffee and just, nod and say hi. I mean, I'm lucky I live in, a small rural town in Ireland, and people are extremely friendly here. So they will just generally say hi to you on the street anyway. But it is actually a hugely important part of our day-to-day lives. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think there's clearly issues with just seeing people right now. But yeah, I think for me, and my usual work day prior to COVID was get up, feed the kids, do whatever I needed to do, drop the kids at school, and then go and sit in a coffee shop for a few hours. And yeah, that didn't naturally lead to conversation, but yeah, just being around people is often enough to take that edge off, I guess.
It seems to be nearly what most of us just need, that little bit, which is, it's fantastic. We've just got the last couple of minutes left, everybody, and I wondered if anyone wanted to hop in with a question before we do head away.
Sorry for asking again, but I'd be curious with regard to rather than working from home, going to a hot desking scenario or innovation hub or some of those things. Is there any best practices actually on those? Like, what's a good one versus a bad one?
Not that I've seen, and I'm sure people have got far better data on this and experience of this than me. I haven't spent much time in them outside of WeWorks in London, and yeah, WeWork is a strange place, to be quite frank. We're sat in a foyer basically, which is an office, and I think that's a bad bad place to work. I think just almost universally people would acknowledge that. I think where you can get away where you need to, there's, I don't know, soundproof rooms, there's rooms for specific purposes. I think generally that's what people lean to. But yeah, I would not say I was an expert on any of co-working spaces specifically.
As we happen to be talking to the local county council, and I mean, they're looking for guidance on what people are looking for. So the attitude they have at the moment is going to build it and they will come, because they can't get meaningful input from, you know, potential clients as to what exactly they're looking for. So just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the data is, and the thing that sticks in my head most is the Buffer report, which breaks down where remote workers tend to work from. And I think statistically, I don't know what the most recent report says, so I'll quote last year's. I think 84% of people work from home most of the time. 8% of people work from a co-working space most of the time. 4% I think was a coffee shop. 3% was a library. And then 2%, I don't know if the maths adds up here, but 2% was everywhere else. So I think that's a pretty good proxy for understanding people's preferences. But yeah, they're going to want to get out of the house 1-2 days a week.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And we're Grania, hop in, please.
Hi, Rose, great chat and great questions and observations. Chris, just a final one. I'm after receiving a tweet. I guest lecture for CIT and IT Tralee down in Munster, beautiful south of Ireland. And my students have constant questions, being that they're obviously cocooning and they're doing all their work from home. And the idea of applying for internships or graduateships, or the great, you know, travel experience that they would have applied for the J1s to go to the States, etc. Now, I know you've advocated, yes, remote working is abroad, but what would you be saying if I got you in front of one of my classes, global business practices, to say the opportunities are ripe in New York, to reach out, to go for it? Do you have any top tips that I could share with them? Yeah, amongst all the tips I've wrote down from today's chat, but I just thought to maybe home in on that cohort of people that we mightn't have addressed today. Thanks.
Yeah, I think what we're beginning to see, and I've got a lot of friends that are in New York and San Francisco, and I think what we're seeing is a general acceptance from those larger organizations who a lot of people aspire to work for, the Microsofts of the world, but also the smaller tech startups, which I think people see as being far more innovative, are increasingly looking to hire remotely. So whether that's on internship basis, I think obviously that's been a massive issue where internships have been cancelled, and that's just a brutal situation for a lot of future professionals to live through, where they don't get that experience prior to joining the job market. But I think it's starting to change, and yeah, we're talking to a few interns in a couple of schools in the Midwest, and I think we've got a lot of friends building startups as well that are definitely open to bringing younger talent on board. And I think the younger generation definitely has certain benefits that will mean that they do well when they're working remotely. I think largely we built relationships. I mean, my generation was on things like MSN Messenger. Older generations built them in person. Other generations built them on the phone. And I think largely Gen Z or Gen X, whatever they're going by, they've naturally built relationships virtually their whole life. So I think they're obviously endowed with the skills that should enable them to excel when they are in a virtual setting. And yeah, I think just generally, I think there's going to be a better environment in the next 2, 3, 4 months with respect to people hiring remotely for internships and things like that.
Right.
Thank you for that, Grania. Just on that, actually, HubSpot do take on remote interns, as do some of the other companies. It's also worthwhile to check out the talent communities for the various remote companies, because there can be a really good into learning about like what they're looking for and making great connections and networking, you know, getting prepared for the career path.
Super. Thanks.
Folks, thank you all so very much for taking the time to join us today and ask questions. We're always having these conversations in Slack, on Twitter, on Facebook. Thank you, Tracy. if you are on Twitter and interested at all, do follow Chris. It is refreshing, and again, no fence sitting whatsoever. It's definitely straight to the point. And Chris, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, and hopefully at some point we'll see you in Scotland or Ireland or somewhere in the world.
Awesome. Appreciate your time.
Have a great week, everybody. We'll talk to you all soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. That was good. Thank you.
Stay safe.